Thank you everybody for joining us this morning for this meeting of the subcommittee standards hearing panel. And we are going to start first of all with agenda one on the, item one on the agenda, which is declarations of interest. Does anybody have any declarations of interest? No, okay, so can we move to democracy officer, please, to, we don't need to do that, do you? Sorry, apologies, yeah, okay. So item two is public participation, and we have 4 people who have registered to speak by public participation. One of those is by phone and the other 3 are in person. So if we can start first of all with the person by phone, Councillor Waters, please. Councillor Waters, can you hear us?
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Well, it's something of a first for me today in that, having registered to speak, I'm somewhat lost for words that this hearing process, pushed through by the monitoring officer, is actually going ahead. Most especially after last week's Joint Standards Committee outright condemnation of the process. But I shan't waste these 3 minutes. I'll actually use some of Councillor Fisher's words that are on public record from 2016 relating to a matter in Strensel, but given the same process an officer involved today, perfectly interchangeable. And I quote, "Having read Miss McKevitt's report, which I consider to be one of the most prejudiced and utterly inaccurate documents I have ever read, I have decided that I will no longer participate in this farce. I disagree with some of the statements she makes, every conclusion she makes, and have absolutely no wish to waste my time on debating a matter of opinion. I am absolutely satisfied that all my comments were honest and based on clear evidence. I do not intend to submit any documents or attend the hearing. I also absolutely will not comply with any sanctions imposed on me, and certainly will not apologise in any way. The Localism Act 2011 lays out the sanctions, and none of them worry me in the slightest. Please tell the Standards Committee to do whatever they wish. I have better things to spend my time on, like serving the residents of Strensel." They were your words, Councillor Fisher, slating a flawed process that you are going to use to sit in judgment on somebody else today. It's a strange role to be asked to carry out, given your views on the process. But of course, it's not just your view. Your colleague, Councillor Chambers, was equally critical in 2016 of this process. A couple of sentences from his lengthy submission are equally interchangeable with today's circumstances. And I quote, "The report by the investigating officer concentrates almost entirely on the information provided by the complainants and contains hardly any factual detail about the history or the origins of the circumstances surrounding the complaint." Or how about this one? And I quote again, "The report will form the evidence to be considered by the City of York Council Hearings Subcommittee. In its present form, the lack of facts, subjectivity, and errors contained within will inevitably give the subcommittee a skewed and shallow version of the events."
You have 30
well, Mr. Hardcastle,
Councillor Waters.
Mr. Hardcastle could well use those words today. The question, given it's the same flawed process, is what do you as a hearing committee propose to do to maintain your personal integrities and that of the Standards Committee as a whole? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Waters. Your comments have been heard and taken into account where relevant. Thank you. The next person to speak is Gwen Swinburne. If you'd like to come forward, thank you. And you have 3 minutes to address the committee.
Thank you, Chair. May I express my concerns, as I have already emailed, that the monitoring officer is continuing in her established path of ignoring proper process. As we have yet no minutes upon which parties can rely if they wish to take up formal complaints, here or in another place, they certainly have cause. Both the subject member asked, as did I, that instead of another hearing, a pre-hearing private session be called to iron out remaining administrative concerns, of which there appear to be a number. Not only did these appeals fall on stony ground, they appear ignored until late Tuesday when, in an email to the subject member, he was told an untruth in yet another administrative fail by the monitoring officer, the deputy this time. She stated that there was no provision for pre-hearings with subject members present. This is evidently not the case, as is on public record. On the 28th of November 2018, a pre-hearing meeting was held, and I quote from the minutes, members discussed procedural issues in relation to the proposed hearing of a complaint against a council member. The subject member and his legal advisor were present at the meeting and took part in the discussions. That subject member was the then deputy, now leader of this council. The rules were the same, I checked line by line. So why is it that this subject member is being denied what was freely available to the now leader? Why is he, and no doubt you, being told it is not possible and being treated differently? Perhaps again, monitoring officers are making one rule for leaders and another for ordinary councillors. This subject member has been disadvantaged in every way possible by the process and by the senior staff. It continues to today. All he asked for was a pre-hearing to address these ongoing administrative concerns, once against President. Chair, may I ask that you establish the training given to the staff who write these reports? I can only advise you, as painful as it might be, to shut this down, supply the subject member with an independent person to navigate him through a pre-hearing that can finally set this case on an even keel for the subject member and the complainant. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms Swinburne, and your comments will be taken into account, but I would just like to start here by saying that we have absolutely followed the procedure that is outlined in Annex D. And if you read that procedure, it says that at the chair's discretion, this procedure can be adapted. And we have not adapted that procedure. We have followed it to the letter, because that situation that you raised in 2018 was actually where the chair chose to step outside the procedure.
I understand.
And we are not stepping outside the procedure.
I understand.
So
that.
I would rather that we don't hear about that again, because I have explained that, and those were my words that went through to Councillor Hardcastle about why he wouldn't be attending a pre-hearing meeting. The pre-hearing meeting is about the panel discussing the case, how we're going to conduct the case, and making sure that we understand the procedure for the day, and that is what happened. And I don't really want to talk about it again, please, because I think that's been evidently clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, can I have the next public speaker, please, Ian Chambers? You have 3 minutes, Mr. Chambers, and please can you keep your comments relevant to the meeting of today as outlined on the agenda. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Ian Chambers, now a Deaton Parish Councillor. As Councillor Hardcastle was denied having fellow parish councillors interviewed by the investigating officer, I would like to take this opportunity to inform the hearing panel of events that have led up to this hearing and why Mrs Hale has not been allowed to rejoin Deaton Parish Council and by whom. At a parish council meeting 24th of June 2019, with the then chairman Trevor Bartram, Eve Hale vice chair, Neil Hale councillor and Helen Guest clerk to the council, at the top table, the clerk was asked where the attendance register and laptop were. She said that she'd left them in her car but made no attempt to retrieve them. Mrs Hale, referring to the public, looked at myself and my wife, members of the public at that time, and asked pointedly if we had anything to say. When I asked about concerns raised previously regarding parish council finances, the named councillors and clerk stood, obviously pre-planned, and walked out while Councillor Bartram threw the parish council chequebook, conveniently accessible, across the table to Councillor Hardcastle, saying that we thought we could do better than we should try. Councillor Hardcastle, new to the council, attempted to diffuse the situation with his fellow councillors and clerk by asking Councillor Bartram into a side room to discuss the situation, but to no avail. Those top table councillors and clerk all subsequently resigned, probably to avoid a complaint which had already been lodged with the monitoring officer at that time. When access was regained to the parish council email account, earlier emails between Helen Guest and Eve Hale were found, some extremely disrespectful to other councillors of that time and to members of the public, and one from Eve Hale asking whether she should bring old Betsy, her husband's gone, to the next meeting. At the parish council meeting 11th January 2021, Councillor Bartram proposed that Mrs Hale should be co-opted back onto the council. Despite there being nobody prepared to second her application, in the interest of fairness, Councillor Hardcastle, as chairman, suggested that it should be put to the vote. The council, not Councillor Hardcastle, refused her application by a vote of 4-1 against. The complaint against Councillor Hardcastle claims that he has used his position to influence whether Mrs Hale should be allowed to rejoin the council, inferring that he had bullied the other councillors into refusing her access.
You have 30 seconds.
This was not the case. I would have voted against Mrs Hale rejoining the council on the grounds of her previous unsuitable and disrespectful behaviour. I believe that the other councillors also made up their own decisions without influence, as was put into a letter or document that was sent and signed by those parish councils. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Chambers. Your comments will be taken into account as relevant at the point we feel they're needed. Thank you. Our next speaker is Jean Fletcher. You have 3 minutes. Thank you.
My name's Jean Fletcher and I'm a councillor on Deaton Parish Council. I also had a number of complaints made against me from the same persons and at the same time as Councillor Hardcastle, but it was decided not to investigate the latest allegation as it was related to something that I was supposed to have done before I became a councillor. As members of the electorate, Mr Hardcastle and I had very serious concerns about the monies being spent by the council and realised that the council was not fulfilling its legal obligations regarding public participation because they were failing to post notices giving details of meetings. In fact, no notices had been displayed on the notice boards or on the council's website for at least 8 months. It seemed to us that the public were not welcomed and that the parish council was being run more like a private club. Unfortunately, there does not appear to be any mechanism for complaining about a council that's not following the rules. And we found ourselves with no option other than to make formal complaints through the council's own complaints procedure, which we both did. These complaints were never answered. This was one of the reasons that I put myself forward at the elections in May 2019. The existing chairman and vice chairman, Mrs Hale, and her husband were also re-elected, but they resigned along with the parish clerk at a stage-managed meeting in June, where they all walked out saying it was untenable to work with us. Mrs Hale states in her complaint that Mr Hardcastle had personal animosity towards her, but I believe that any animosity is on the side of some of the previous council members who did not like being challenged or held accountable for the shortcomings that we complained about. Their resignations left only 3 members and no clerk to carry on the council. 10 electors then requested an election to fill the vacancies, and all 3 of the above mentioned were re-elected, but they all declined to take up their positions, citing ill health as the reason. I would just like to say that I consider these actions, the current investigation, which again has taken far too long to undertake, and 2 standards hearings to be a complete waste of time and public money. Had Councillor Hardcastle been provided with the opportunity to have witnesses questioned, I feel sure that we would not now be in the position that we find ourselves. I've always found Councillor Hardcastle to be respectful, fair-minded and honourable, and he has my wholehearted support, as has the parish council that ultimately made the decision not to co-opt Mrs Hale. Thank you.
Thank you. Your comments will be taken into account at the point where they're felt relevant. Right, I'd just like to return to an aspect that I should have covered earlier, and just to remind everybody that this Joint Standards Committee hearing panel was adjourned on the 31st of August 2021 until today. And because we've all been in the room before, I assume that everybody knows who we are, but I am Councillor Claire Douglas and I am the chair for today. And the panel is made up of Councillor Chambers here, and this is Councillor Fisher. We also have the Democratic Services Officer with us, Fiona Young over here, and the Monitoring Officer and Deputy Monitoring Officer in attendance on this side of the room. Our independent person, Harrod Davis, she's joining, watching remotely at the moment, and will be available to us should we need her advice. So let's move to agenda item 3 at this point, which is exclusion of press and public. Sorry, we have 4 registered members of the through public participation. I don't have a 5th. I don't think that application to speak went through to the right place or made within the time frame that it should be. For this particular meeting today, or did you do it previously? Okay. Can we see that then, please, Mr. Bartram? Would somebody be able to help? Thank you. Yeah, this piece of paper here, I'm afraid doesn't give me any detail about when the request was submitted or for what meeting it was for. And whilst I understand that is very frustrating, it's hard for me to see that it was a written statement. Okay, one moment, please, Mr. Bartram. Will we accept a written statement? If you could just give us a few moments, please. We're going to double check the inbox to see if that was received, because as I've said previously, this process needs to be absolutely equitable. And Mr. Bartram, if we can find evidence that this was submitted via the inbox, then you will be able to speak. But if we can't, I'm afraid we're not going to be able to accept that or the statement that you've made. So if you can just give us a few moments, please. Everybody, we've just checked the system, and Mr. Bartram, your request did come in on time. So please, if you would go ahead and address the panel. Thank you. You have 3 minutes to speak. Thank you.
I was previous chairman of Deaton Parish Council. I resigned as chairman and returned to the council as a councillor. Since then, I've resigned again. I attended a parish council meeting on Monday, the 21st of September 2020, where the position of council vacancy came up. It was discussed, but at the time it ran out and the guillotine fell. It was then moved to a Zoom meeting on the 11th of January 2021. Just before the meeting, I received a letter by hand from Councillor Brack regarding Mrs. Hale's application for co-op. I found this letter totally unacceptable, as this letter was not on the agenda. I deem it not a legal document, therefore it should not have been discussed. Also, as the application had been discussed at the last meeting, those that discussed it would preempt the outcome. Also, there was only one application and there was no need to discuss it or vote on it. I made this point perfectly clear to the chairman and the clerk, which were both chose to ignore. That's my statement.
Thank you, Mr. Bartram.
Thank you.
Your comments will be taken into account where they felt they're relevant. Thank you. Right. Okay. So if we can return to the proceedings, as I was in the middle of saying that our independent person, Anne Harrick Davis, is available to give us advice, and she is watching the meeting remotely at the moment. So we're moving on to exclusion of press and public. That's agenda item 3. I know that the parties both have expressed their wishes as part of the pre-hearing procedure in place for the hearing to take place in public, and hence that is where we are today at this point in time. I support this, and with the proposal that the press and public be excluded by any request from the panel for legal advice, the subcommittee's deliberations and decision making at the end of the hearing. This will be done in private, and so I would like to ask the panel whether to hold in public except for a request by the panel for legal advice to deliberations and decision making. Can I see your thoughts on that? Those in agreement with excluding press and public for deliberations and advice? Thank you. So that's granted, and the rest of the hearing will take place in public. Agenda item 4 is the complaint against a member of a council covered by the Joint Standards Committee. I'd now like the following parties to introduce themselves in the following order: Mrs. Hale and her representative, Mrs. Mercer, so that's the complainant. Councillor Hardcastle, who's the subject councillor from Dayton Parish Council, and his representative, Mr. Brack, who is also a councillor at Dayton Parish Council. And then we also have with us today Walter Burns, who is the investigating officer. Thank you. Can I just ask for confirmation from all parties that you have seen the final report of the investigating officer and have had an opportunity to engage in the pre-hearing procedures? Can you just show me that you've seen that, Councillor Hardcastle? Have you seen the report of the investigating officer? Okay, and you've engaged in the pre-hearing procedures, so you've responded to the questionnaire and yes, and received all the documentation, the agenda and outline of procedures, etc.
Yes.
Thank you. And Mrs. Hale, have you had the same? Yes, yes, great, thank you very much. Before we go any further, there are a few administrative issues we'd like to deal with. First of all, Councillor Hardcastle indicated on his pre-hearing checklist that he wished to call witnesses. The panel have considered this request and decided that calling these witnesses would not aid the panel with their determination. Mrs. Hale also made a request after submission of her pre-hearing checklist to call witnesses, and the panel also determined that these witnesses would not assist either. Therefore, the panel will hear from Mrs. Hale and Councillor Hardcastle only, and your representatives, if you so choose, that they will speak in your stead. Mrs. Hale has requested that Mrs. Mercer be present in the capacity of her representative. This request was made after the last meeting. Of this subcommittee, and the panel have determined that Mrs. Hale can have Mrs. Mercer as her representative. Councillor Hardcastle has requested that Mr. Brack be his representative at this hearing, and the panel have accepted that Mr. Brack can undertake this role at the hearing. However, Councillor Hardcastle also wished Mr. Brack to give evidence in his capacity of Councillor of Dayton Parish Council. The panel have not permitted Mr. Brack's presence in any other role than representative for Councillor Hardcastle. Therefore, Mr. Brack will not be permitted to give evidence as a witness at this hearing. One final thing, parts of the report contained redactions. These redactions related to another complaint which was investigated, where the investigating officer did not find that a breach of the code had taken place. And also persons who were named who are not either the complainant or subject counsellor of the hearing today have been redacted. Could I ask that names of anyone other than the complainant, Mrs. Hale, and the subject counsellor are not used during the hearing, and that the parties, so far as they can, keep to the areas in dispute. So next stage is that we identify the areas of dispute. The main areas of dispute which the panel will determine today are as follows. Mrs. Hale believes that Councillor Hardcastle had a personal animosity against her and that he delayed her application to be co-opted onto Dayton Parish Council due to this. The investigating officer found that the content of the chair's statement of 2020 was inappropriate and that a reasonable person may well regard the statement as disrespectful. The investigating officer found that the statement made it clear what Councillor Hardcastle's personal opinions were, which made it difficult for a fair decision to be made by the parish council, and that the presumption of bias against Mrs. Hale was clear following the statement. Councillor Hardcastle disagreed with the investigating officer's report. He believed the process to be flawed and biased. He felt that the investigating officer's refusal to interview 7 witnesses resulted in him being treated unfairly. In addition, Councillor Hardcastle felt that the complaint contained allegations which had not been proven. Councillor Hardcastle stated that the investigation referred, in his view, incorrectly to the fact that the application had been delayed. Therefore, he believed that the whole investigation had not been carried out on the specific allegations stated in the complaint. Can the panel confirm that these facts are agreed and that the panel will rule upon these facts that are in dispute? Are we in agreement on that, Councillor Fisher? Yes, okay, so the panel is in agreement on that, and these will be the disputes that are ruled upon today. So the next item that I will outline to you is the order of proceedings. The order of proceedings will be as follows. The investigating officer will first of all summarise investigation and the findings in his draft report. Members of the panel are then able to ask questions of the investigating officer. The monitoring officer may also ask questions of the investigating officer. Mrs. Hale and then Councillor Hardcastle will be asked whether there are any issues which ought to be raised with the investigating officer. I will either put these issues to the investigating officer or will allow the party to ask the questions directly. Then Mrs. Hale will summarise her case in relation to the facts in dispute. The panel will then ask questions and then the monitoring officer of Mrs. Hale. The investigating officer and Councillor Hardcastle will be asked whether there are any issues which ought to be raised. And again, I will determine whether to put these issues to Mrs. Hale or whether I will allow the party to ask the questions directly. Following that, Councillor Hardcastle will summarise his case, again in relation to the facts in dispute, and the panel and the monitoring officer will be able to ask questions of Councillor Hardcastle around his case. The investigating officer and Mrs. Hale will be asked whether there are any issues which ought to be raised. And again, I will determine whether to put these issues to Councillor Hardcastle myself, or whether I will allow the party to ask the questions directly. Each party, the investigating officer, Mrs. Hale, and Councillor Hardcastle will be able to make representations on each of the facts in dispute. The panel will then commence deliberations in private before announcing in public their findings and reasons. If the panel finds that Councillor Hardcastle has breached the code of conduct, I will invite representations from the parties as to what action, if any, should be taken. The panel will deliberate any sanction in private and will then publicly announce a decision. Written notice of the findings will then be issued. So we move now on to the summaries, and I will now invite the parties to summarise their case. So that's Mrs. Hale first, followed by Councillor Hardcastle. Oh, sorry, the investigating officer first, followed by Mrs. Hale, and then Councillor Hardcastle. The parties will have 5 minutes to summarise, and we will hear from the parties in the following order: investigating officer, Mrs. Hale, Councillor Hardcastle. So if Mr. Burns would like to go ahead, Walter Burns, the investigating officer, to summarise the case, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The report I compiled has been circulated.
Sorry, excuse me, Mr. Burns. Could you speak up a bit, please? Because it's quite difficult to hear in here, and if you speak directly into the mic, thank you.
Okay, you've all had a copy of the report. It was circulated with the papers. I cover in there how the process I followed of interviews, which were done obviously not face-to-face in the present circumstances. Happy to answer any questions about the actual process that anybody wants to raise. In summary, I was targeting the areas that we've already discussed, where there was any animosity or bad feeling between the complainant and the subject councillor. Whether then there was a delay in actually dealing with the application for the complainant to co-option application to be considered. Whether that feeling 1 and 2, i.e. whether there was a misfeeling and the delay, were linked, and one caused the other. And then if that were the case, did that constitute, in my mind, a breach of the parish council's code of conduct? So on the question of the animosity or the bad feeling, dislike, whatever you want to call it, I think it's quite clear what the event was about. It seemed clear to me from the evidence I saw, and that we actually already heard today from some of the public speakers, that there was an atmosphere, not just between the complainant and the subject councillor, but generally with some of the previous councillors, the previous clerks, which was quite toxic, really. I saw evidence that it went as far back as 2019, when planning applications within the village were discussed, and I think the subject council didn't feel the parish council at that time was supporting his objection to those planning applications. I've seen the emails which have been referred to here about threats, as Councillor Hardcastle states in his statement of last year, that were made to him by Mrs. Hale and other councillors. So it was, and the actual statement which is referred to, the chairman's statement which is referred to and cited in the form of complaint, it's quite clear that what the chairman of the parish council's feelings were towards those councillors, and what he would do to resist any attempt for them to get back onto the council. So to me, it was clear there was animosity, disrespect, bad feeling, whatever you want to call it. The second aspect was delay. To me, that was quite clear. The application was made in March of 2020. There were at least 5 council meetings that took place between then and January this year, 21. There's evidence that it was on the agenda, but then was withdrawn, or guillotines came down and didn't consider it. So in my view, it was an undue delay. I took into consideration the COVID and the pandemic implications, that things couldn't be heard as they usually are. But it was quite clear to me that 10 months for a decision to be made, and the decision was made in January, after the complaint was lodged in November. So I took some weight from the fact that it was only considered then, probably because the complaint was lodged in the first place. So 10 months to me is disrespectful, it's untimely, and the chairman of the council in that role should see businesses conducted in a timely manner and should have been dealt with in whatever form before that time. I hadn't seen any letter that had been sent to the complainant to explain the delay or to give reasons why there should be a delay and when it would be heard. That may be the case. Nothing was sent to me on that point. And obviously, was 1 and 2 linked? I think it was, with a statement that the chairman made in his annual statement. He would resist any attempt for any individuals to rejoin the council. So I think that was there was a link there. And the breaches for me of the code with that disrespect shown to a member of the public, and actually because of the statement he made in his annual report, it was in his interest not to have that person back on the council, potentially to protect maybe not just his interest, but the interest of the councillors that he had at that time on the council. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Burns. So now the panel has the opportunity to ask Mr. Burns any questions, as does the monitoring officer. Would anybody like to ask Mr. Burns any questions? No, I don't think we have any further questions for Mr. Burns. Thank you for that. The next person who will summarise their case with 5 minutes, and I will give you Oh, sorry. Mrs. Hale, do you have any questions for Mr. Burns? Okay, thank you. Mr. Hardcastle, do you have any questions for Mr. Burns? Okay, one moment. Please, can you turn on your microphone, and you will address me for a start, and I would like to hear what your questions are, and then I will make a decision as to whether, yeah, well, it's a kind of irrelevant, but yeah, if you could just address me, please, with what your concerns are, and then we'll move forward with those.
Right. Okay, bear with me, please. I've got. Can we both put questions?
I think they should be agreed questions, because Mr. Brack is your representative, so he can put your questions forward on your behalf. But this shouldn't be a long, protracted toing and froing. So please agree what you want to ask, and then decide who's going to put them to Mr. Burns. Thank you.
Right, okay. Yeah, go on then. Yeah.
Sorry, obviously we're new to this, and it's you know,
Sorry,
you have to
Mr.
sort of bear
Brack,
with us
can
a little bit as we go on. So
Mr. Brack, can I just check if you've got your microphone on?
turn it on now.
Okay,
Yeah?
thank you.
Okay. Mr. Burns, after Mr. Hardcastle received your draft statement, and I was
Mr.
made
Brack,
party
sorry, you're addressing the questions to me, and then I will.
to you. Okay.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Mr. Burns admitted some evidence from me into the process. I emailed him to say that I felt he should have a chronology. The only place that really where a delay or the blocking of this
Excuse me, Mr. Brack, is this a question or is this a statement about process? Is it a question to Mr. Burns, please, not a statement about process, because that has been outlined.
It's a question to Mr. Burns
in the agenda.
It's whether he fully considered the chronology that was sent to him. I sent him an email, and he said, "Thank you for this, which I will consider, as it may need to be shared, so it may take some more time." This was something that he accepted to have into evidence. I want to ask him whether he fully considered it, and whether that this stated what happened at each of the meetings that there were, the 5 meetings, as to whether Councillor Hardcastle delayed or blocked the application, and it states what everything. I just want to ask him whether he fully considered that, and whether he's actually passed that on to the panel.
From my understanding, it was made clear that the investigating officer wouldn't be calling on additional evidence, and that the evidence, I believe, that you're talking about is submitted to him at a later date, when he had already made it clear that he wouldn't be accepting that. And is that the case, Mr. Burns?
No, I didn't. I interviewed the subject councillor. I didn't see it necessary to talk to 5 or 6 others. I was contacted directly by Councillor Brack, who said he'd seen the draft report, which I considered to be inappropriate in the first place, as it was confidential at that time. He threatened that if I didn't interview him, he would seek to take a resolution to his council to take complaints against me. I did interview him. I took into consideration all the evidence that he sent me. I've actually got a copy of the summary he gave me, which sets out the reasons why he thought any of the 5 council meetings the matter wasn't dealt with. I did consider them. I don't consider them to have any weight. it attempts to say that it is a council decision or his decision to seek to postpone or not delay, or the clerk's decision. I took those into consideration. I didn't accept them. I saw that a matter that could be dealt with potentially in half an hour, in 10 months, when there was a legal obligation for the parish council regulations to consider co-options that should have been dealt with in that period of time. I did not accept the reasons or excuses for it not being dealt with.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Burns. Mr. Brack, do you have any further questions?
Yes, but Mr. Burns accepted what I'd sent him into evidence for this panel. I just would like to know whether you've read this
Mr.
Chair, I think that the panel has heard sufficient on this particular aspect. In my view, the investigating officer is being very clear about the status of the alleged evidence that is being put forward, and has also made it very clear in his report about the status of that, and I think he's given an adequate response for the panel in order to be able to decide and progress further.
Yes, yeah, and I'm in agreement with that. Mr. Brack, Councillor Hardcastle, if you have any further questions on different aspects that Mr. Burns has outlined, please move on to that now.
I don't know. Can I just
Mr. Brack,
can I just ask?
No, Mr. Brack, this is a formal hearing and we are following a procedure here that has been outlined to you, and the procedure is clear and we are following it as in all of the documentation, and it is not an opportunity for you to take on a different procedure that you see fit and proper.
I'm sorry, I just want to ask.
Excuse me, Mr. Brack. Thank you. To ask questions is absolutely fine, but to run over the procedure repeatedly is not what we're here for. Thank you. So please, if you would like to ask another question, then please do. Thank you. Go ahead.
Chair, I'd like...
Councillor Hardcastle. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Mr. Burns, through yourself, in the investigation report, he said that the statement wasn't to form part of this, yet he keeps referring to it all the time. And he contradicts what he said in his report. In another email that he sent out, when asked about looking at further evidence and witnesses, he stated in an email that he'd spent considerable time on this already. Is that what it boils down to? Not because we should see witnesses? Sorry, Chair. Sorry,
Councillor Hardcastle, we're not going to go through the ins and outs of those minutiae aspects of the procedure, but I will give Mr. Burns the opportunity to respond to those comments. Thank you. Happy
to, Chair. Yeah. It was quite clear that the statement he's made in his annual statement, which formed part of the complaint, I've used as evidence as to the nature of the relationship between the two parties. I've not used it as said that it forms part of the complaint. I have made a comment that in actual fact, I think it is inappropriate, and that a panel or a monitoring officer might want to consider that as a side issue. But it's quite clear that I've only used the statement, the words in his statement, which were part of the complaint, as evidence to show the nature of the relationship between the two and whether animosity existed or not. As to listening to other witnesses, I've already stated that I interviewed one more under duress. The information that I received from the person wasn't particularly difficult from what I've heard from the subject councillor. My perception was that if I talked to another 5 or 6 people, and 3 or 4 of them have spoke publicly today, we would hear exactly the same type of allegations against the past conduct of the complainant. Now, I'm not saying that is untrue, but that's not the subject of this investigation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Burns. Councillor Hardcastle, do you have another question for Mr. Burns?
I have more questions. I've also a comment on what Mr. Burns has said. He said,
Your opportunity is to question Mr. Burns, not to comment on what he's just said.
but Mr. Burns just said he interviewed.
Questions, Councillor Hardcastle. This isn't an opportunity for a to and fro. He will answer your questions, but you won't be able to comment on his his answers.
Even though I disagree with his answers.
Chair, Councillor Hardcastle does have the opportunity to sum up towards the end of this procedure, and I suggest that if he has comment or observations to share with yourselves based on the responses he's heard from Mr. Burns, he uses the opportunity of the summing up to do that. At the moment, the procedure is very clear. This is an opportunity to ask questions by yourselves, not an opportunity to sum up on comments that he's heard thus far.
Okay, is that okay? That's clear to you, Councillor Hardcastle, that you'll have the opportunity to sum up and raise items that you disagree with later. This is an opportunity to ask questions at this point.
Okay. Okay, Chair. I'd like to ask why Mr. Burns produced a draft report and emailed it to me. There was inaccuracies in there. It was basically a character assassination of me. There was assumptions made. It was not a fact-finding investigative report. He emailed me to say that was coming to me.
Excuse me, Councillor Hardcastle, is this a question?
This is a question, yeah.
Please, can you get to the question part now?
Right, it was a draft report. Didn't say he was going to send it to anybody. He sent it to the monitoring officer who saw that. Why did you send it to the monitoring officer when it's a draft report, which the final report was amended?
Mr. Burns.
All I can make sense of that is that I produce a draft report. So the procedure says that the draft report is sent to both the complainant and to the subject counsellor before I decide to make a final draft, which then goes to the monitoring officer. And that's the process I followed. It was not shared with the monitoring officer or the deputy monitoring officer before comments had come back from the two parties, and I amended the contract, actually taking into consideration positively, I thought, some of those comments.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Burns. Councillor Hardcastle, do you have any further questions for Mr. Burns? Please go ahead.
In what Mr. Burns has just said is the fact that it took 10 months to make a decision or something like that. Has he taken into consideration the fact that we were in the middle of a global pandemic, and I don't think we had any parish council meetings for something like 6 months?
Yeah, I think Mr. Burns addressed this earlier, but Mr. Burns, could you just respond to that, please?
Yeah, quite easily. There were 5 meetings. I covered that point particularly. The evidence we've already referred to, Councillor Bratt gave me, actually states what meetings there were and what dates they were at. I've seen evidence from the clerk at the time stating some advice they'd taken from the Yorkshire Local Councils Association about matters should be dealt with because it would be a legal imperative to consider applications. And that it should be dealt with. This was October of last year. There was meetings in November and then January. So I did take all that into consideration. I don't accept, and it was 10 months, and there were meetings in between.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Thank you. Councillor Hardcastle, do you have any further questions for Mr. Burns?
Yes, I have. I can't see where the evidence is that I've done wrong.
Sorry, Councillor Hardcastle, as we said earlier, this is an opportunity to ask questions at this point in time, and you'll be able to sum up later. So if you have a question, please go ahead. Thank you.
I'd like to ask Mr. Burns, where's the evidence? Where's the key evidence that made him make the decision?
Mr. Burns, can you please answer what evidence that you used in order to come to your decision?
Yes, I mean, there's evidence. There's direct evidence, there's indirect evidence. Indirect evidence can be circumstantial. It doesn't always have to be. I'll admit here, there is no smoking gun of an email written by the councillor, the subject councillor, which says, on no account should this matter be dealt with. I want to block this application. I don't like this woman, and it's not going to come forward. I have seen an email which he wrote to the clerk at the time, containing some other things. This was back in October of last year again. I shall respond to the points and emails later in the week. However, for clarification, there is to be no official response to Eve Hale in regard to the vacancy until the council has met. That was October, 7 months after the application was made. It was subsequently dealt with in January. Now, he as chairman should be driving the business of that council. The clerk helps and advises and brings matters forward. He as the chairman makes sure that the business of the council is dealt with in a timely manner. That is my view of a chairman. That's the difference between a chairman and the members of the council. The evidence is, there is some direct hard evidence. The other consequential evidence about the statement in his plan of his and the way that actually there was a chance to deal with it, but wasn't dealt with. On the actual hearing itself in January, he chaired the meeting, even though he knew there was a complaint against it. He didn't declare an interest at the meeting. He didn't vote it, I accept, it was 4-1 because there was no need to, and didn't withdraw from the meeting. So in that respect, potentially there's another breach of the code there, which I haven't referred to, because of the declarations of interest. So I think there is plenty of evidence that I've seen. It's not all direct evidence, as he, I think, is alluding to, but there is circumstantial indirect evidence as well as some direct that there was inaction.
Thank you.
Chair,
Yes.
apologies. Mr. Burns has just quoted from an email which is not within the papers, but you are within your right to ask for a copy of that email so that it's formally included within your papers and for it to be circulated to Mrs. Hale and to Councillor Hardcastle and their respective representatives, if you feel, given that it's been quoted from, that they should also have formal sight of it. It's your discretion. It's the panel's view as to whether that should be shared.
We think that would be useful for everybody. So please, could we have that email included?
I'm quoting from an email that Councillor Hardcastle sent to me as evidence during his following the interview with him.
Is that, yes, we can accept that.
That is acceptable. I think it is just the purpose of the property of the email, the clarity in it, so that you can also see the wording of the email that has just been read out to you. So it's having that physical document in front of you for clarity and transparency. Chair, we're happy to make a photocopy.
Yes, please. If you could make a photocopy and distribute it to everybody, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Councillor Hardcastle, do you have any further questions for Mr. Burns?
Sorry, Chair, can my representative ask?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead, Mr. Brack. Questions, please.
Question. There were 5 council meetings. At the meeting 16th of March 2020, the application was not on the agenda. Could Councillor Hardcastle have delayed or blocked Ms. Hale's application on that date?
Mr. Burns?
I accept that the meeting in March was far too early to consider the application.
At the meeting of the 20th of July 2020, Ms. Hale's co-option was not on the agenda. Could Councillor Hardcastle have blocked or delayed her application at that meeting?
Already covered that point, Chair, in as much as it was his duty as a chairman of the council to make sure the business of the council, including any applications, was dealt with. It's not for the clerk or the councillors to decide what's on the agenda.
Yes, yeah, thank you for that, Mr. Burns.
That's not right.
I think that we are straying into an area that it is something that the panel would like to understand more from Councillor Hardcastle at the time, and I don't think it's really Mr. Burns' position to answer these questions when the panel doesn't really have the full information about process and procedure and how things are handled at Dayton Parish Council in front of us at this point in time. So I'm happy that the panel will take on board some of those concerns you have and make a decision around these aspects at that point in time when we have the chance to ask you some questions as well. Do you have any other questions?
Yes, sorry, yes. Can I just continue with these? I'm just asking how, you know.
No, I think I've just told you that I don't believe that this is the time for Mr. Burns to outline his view on whether that should have been addressed at that point in time. I would prefer to for the panel to understand what the procedure is that Dayton Parish Council should have carried out, and that will come at a later point in the meeting.
Chair, I agree on that. I think there is the opportunity for the panel to explore the views of Councillor Hardcastle in terms of the construction of agendas, the process to be followed for absolute clarity, given that Councillor Hardcastle is the parish councillor for Dayton Parish Council. The investigating officer is not, and the person who submitted the complaint form is also not a councillor of Dayton Parish Council. So my view is that that is appropriate questioning for Councillor Hardcastle at the relevant process in this hearing.
And so the panel will ask you questions around that later, and you'll be able to put forward your concerns at that point, Mr. Brack.
Okay.
Do you have any other questions for Mr. Burns on his aspect of the process, the report that he produced?
Let's leave it at that. Hopefully we get out.
Councillor Hardcastle, do you want to speak?
Yeah, I do want to speak, actually.
Okay,
I think, again, if Mr. Burns has just made a statement that's not correct, and if I can't comment on that, then what's the point in being here?
That you will be able to comment, but not at this point. This is the point for asking questions on the report and the statement that Mr. Burns has given. You will be able to sum up later, Mr. Councillor Hardcastle.
But Chair, that's going to lose the impact.
That's not the point, really. We're following a procedure that's been outlined to you that everybody will be expected to follow. And we're not stepping outside that procedure, as I said earlier, right at the beginning of the meeting.
Okay.
Sorry, do you have any further questions for Mr. Burns?
Got lots of questions, but you won't let me ask them, so I've got no further questions.
No, but there's a
Thank you.
difference between questions and statement, Councillor Hardcastle, and that's what we're trying to get towards. So if you have questions, please go ahead, but not statements at this point.
Okay, Chair. Mr. Burns stated that he did, under duress, interview a witness. Who did he interview?
Mr. Burns?
Already said that, Chair. Councillor Brack, I used the word under duress because it was under a threat of him that I did not interview him. He would seek to make a complaint against me as the investigating officer.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. And that actually is, Mr. Brack, this isn't an opportunity for you to make comment on that. This is actually included in the agenda papers. This isn't new information. Any other questions?
Yes, Chair. He hasn't answered the question. Who did he stated he interviewed somebody? Who did he interview?
Mr. Brack was the person.
He didn't interview him. He didn't interview him.
Well, I took the evidence, sorry, Chair. I took evidence from him.
You refused to interview. You didn't interview him.
Councillor
It's a lie.
Hardcastle.
You didn't interview him. I'm sorry, I'm not going to sit here and accept lies. The man did not interview him.
And please, can we mind our language about what terms we use for each other? Respectful language only, please. We are councillors after all.
Chair, I retract that. I did not interview him under Zoom, as I did apologise for that. I did accept to take evidence which Councillor Brack submitted, and one of which was the list of the reasons why it wasn't considered at one of those hearings. So
Okay.
I did not interview you. I agree. It's been a bit of time, but yes, I did take evidence that you said.
Okay, thank you. Can I just ask for clarification then, Mr. Burns? What form did the evidence from Mr. Brack take that you took into consideration?
Copy documents, emails, statements, minutes of the council meetings, which he sent me via email.
Thank you. Any further questions at this point, Mr. Brack or Councillor Hardcastle?
Yes, Chair. Just the fact that when I asked for Mr. Brack to be interviewed and Mr. Brack asked to be interviewed, is it correct that Mr. Burns refused to interview?
I think we've already heard that Mr. Burns decided not to interview any witnesses. He has stated that.
Thank you.
Mr. Burns, do you want to respond in any different way?
Yes, if I can, Chair, just to reiterate the point to my thinking on that, and I think it's probably supported by the statements that you read out slightly earlier, that the panel has considered the request to call witnesses would not aid the panel in their deliberation determinations. Obviously come to that reason for a particular reason, that my feeling was that it wouldn't add anything more than I've already seen or heard.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Any further questions, Mr. Brack or
yes, I've just got one more question.
Excuse me, one moment, Mr. Brack. Sorry, I can't hear you when you're speaking over me. Go ahead, please. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. Mr. Burns, you say I put you under duress in order to accept this statement. That's not true, is it? That's not true, is it?
That you're addressing me, Mr. Brack, please,
Okay.
as chair. Go
Okay.
through the chair. Mr. Burns, do you want to respond to that? I do feel we've already heard what
Yeah, we're
Mr.
just
Burns
going
said
back
around
over the
process.
same ground, Chairman. I received an email directly from him, unsolicited, Councillor Brack, to say that if I did not interview or receive some evidence from him, then he would personally seek to take a resolution to the parish council to make a complaint against me. I sent that email to the monitoring officer and the deputy monitoring officer because I saw it was intimidatory behaviour against me in carrying out my role. I took that to be beyond the scope of this investigation. Under duress, whatever words we used, I conceded to take that evidence from him. I did not interview him. I apologise again. I took evidence from him in the light of being seen to be fair-minded, even though I didn't think it would add that much more, which indeed it didn't. He sent me some information which the subject council had already sent me, but I did it to be seen to be transparent and fair-minded. But whether it's under duress or coerced or whatever, I felt intimidated to take evidence from him.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Any further questions on different item, Mr. Brack or Councillor Hardcastle?
No, not from me.
Yes, Chair, I've just got this piece of paper that's just been put. I don't think this should have been discussed today. The first two paragraphs, I think, are regarding the other complaint, which I was exonerated from. Why has this been in today's meeting? Nothing to do with this complaint. We're completely exonerated from that. Why is this now in the public domain?
The final paragraph of the email, third paragraph, is relevant to the case today. That's why it's now in the public domain.
So why wasn't the other two bits redacted?
Sorry, say that again?
Sorry, Chair, so why weren't the first two paragraphs redacted? Why is this here? I was exonerated from that complaint.
We're considering the third paragraph today in this case. Thank you.
No further questions.
Thank you, Councillor Hardcastle and Mr. Brack. The next stage in the hearing today is that Mrs. Hale will present her summary, and following that, the panel and the monitoring officer will be able to question Mrs. Hale, and the investigating officer and Councillor Hardcastle will then be able to ask questions following that. So, Mrs. Hale, you have 5 minutes to present your case. Thank you.
The reason that I actually put the complaint in against Councillor Hardcastle was after reading his public statement on his chairman's report 2020, where he would do everything in his power to stop this person, myself, co-opting, as I was the only applicant. And you directly.
Sorry, Mrs. Hale, could you speak into the microphone? Move it closer to you if you need to, and speak up a bit as well, please, so everybody can hear, because the acoustics in here are particularly bad. Right. Thank you.
Is that better? So that made a lot of anger among the parishioners, and I was approached by several people who knew that I had made a co-option application, and they were very, very angry. Does Mr. Hardcastle also call into question the integrity of Mr. Burns? Well, I think we've covered that in depth, and as far as I'm concerned, he had the same opportunity as I did to speak with Mr. Burns at length about the issues in my complaint. I didn't ask for any witness statements. I've provided the paper documentation via email to Mr. Burns. There is historic animosity, which had been stated in my complaint initially. I realised that there was going to be a Zoom meeting on the 11th of January. As I couldn't get the access details, I did actually contact another councillor. Am I not allowed to use his name? For the access details, and despite several attempts, I was unable to access the Zoom link. I've also checked on minutes of the meeting of the 11th of January after I couldn't access the Zoom meeting, where my application was apparently discussed again. There was no evidence of previous discussion on earlier minutes. 21st of September, the items had been removed from the minutes. At the meeting of January 21, there was a mention of a letter circulated by Mr. Brack. I've since seen a copy of this letter where there were emails attached between myself and the previous clerk, who had quite a lot of personal issues going on in her life at the time, and she was the one that was being berated. And so in order, when she was on the phone to me in tears, I sent her the email saying, and it wasn't I was going to bring a gun, it was I was asked my husband to bring his gun. Either way, it was banter between two friends trying to alleviate the tension that she was under. The email that was circulated could only have been accessed off the parish council laptop, and Mr Hardcastle and the current clerk are the only ones that could access the council laptop. So to have scrolled through probably 2 years' emails in order to find something to discredit me seemed extreme. Once again, I felt that this letter was intended to influence the City Council to reject my application. I have an email from June 24th, 2020, stating that Councillor Hardcastle and another councillor, who is now the clerk, wished to move forward with the parish council, but that he, Mr Brack, would resign after a couple of months after our resignations. The letter also states that all complaints against the previous clerk and previous councillors should disappear. At the present time, there's no representative from Crocker Hill. Although we're only a small part of the parish, we require a voice on parish matters. I was the only candidate who applied for the vacancy, and as stated in my application, I have extensive knowledge of the area and experience in parish protocol. As we all know, a parish council chairman has no legislative powers to make decisions without it being discussed through the council. The only person with legislative qualifications is the proper officer, i.e. the clerk. Mr Hardcastle has no previous knowledge of parish council protocol or legislation and refuses to take advice from the proper officer, i.e. the clerk, on the way to deal with matters. He's relatively new to the area and has no local knowledge of residents and area. In all the years that Deaton Parish Council has been in existence, the last few years have divided the village and split the parish. The new clerk, who came in
You
after
have 30 seconds. Mrs.
Right,
Hill.
okay then. The parish council is there to serve the parish and its parishioners, and I feel that over 20 years of being a parish councillor, we always strive to do this. Deaton Parish Council is a relatively small council with little facilities and limited resources, but without the council there is no voice. And it was not about any monetary issues at all when they started to investigate the council. There was no financial discrepancies at all.
Thank you, Mrs. Hale.
Thank you.
Right. Does any members of the panel have any questions for Mrs. Hale? No, we don't. The panel has no questions for Mrs. Hale. Does the monitoring officer? No questions from the monitoring officer. Investigating officer, do you have any questions for Mrs. Hale?
Just one, I think, Chair. During the time from your application in March 20 to the letter you received from the subject councillor in January 21, did you receive any correspondence or message from the council about them dealing with the application?
No, the only time I could find out whether or not my application was being discussed was to look at the agenda or the minutes as posted on the website. That was the only access I had to any information.
Would you think it's courteous for a acknowledgement or some explanation of a delay from receipt of an application to be sent to an applicant?
One would presume
Mrs. Hale,
so.
sorry, can we just slow down the process a bit? The question should come through me. So Mrs. Hale, can you now respond to Mr. Burns, please?
Yes, I would have presumed, bearing in mind that these were Zoom meetings because of the pandemic, I'd still think a courtesy of, it will be discussed in due course, or thank you for your application. And I have had no explanation other than a rejection letter.
Thank you. Mr Burns has no further questions for Mrs Hale. Councillor Hardcastle, Mr Brack, do you have questions for Mrs Hale? And can I remind you to come through me, please? Right, not across the table. Thank you. Please go ahead if you'd like to ask any questions.
Chair, sorry, I struggled to hear what Mrs Hale was saying, a lot of it. But one of the things that Mr Burns just stated, a letter was sent to Mrs Hale when we got the application, a holding letter. And in fact, from my memory, Mrs Mercer was the clerk at the time, actually sent it, or I dictated it.
Okay, is
Now,
there
there wasn't one from
is this a question for Mrs Hale, Councillor Hardcastle?
Yes, well, it is, yes, but I'm not saying it was done after 6-7 months, but at the start of it, there was a letter. At some stage in this process, there was a letter sent. I think it was at the very start.
Okay, Mrs Hale, your application went in March 2020. Did you receive any communication at all to acknowledge your application?
None whatsoever. No, not until I got the rejection letter.
No email, no letter, no phone call?
No.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Hardcastle, do you have any other questions for Mrs Hale?
No.
Okay, thank you. We have been going for nearly an hour and a half now. I'd like to suggest or put it to you that we potentially have a break. Does anybody need a break, or should we complete the summaries aspect and then take a break? Yeah, okay. Can we have, sorry, somebody's just asked me that they would like to take a break for a comfort break. So can we come back to resume at 25 to? So this is a very quick break now, just to use bathrooms, get a drink if people would like that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, thank you, everybody. If you could take your seats and we will resume. It's now 25 to. Thank you. So we'll start from where we left off, was under summaries, and Councillor Hardcastle, you now have 5 minutes to present your case, and then the panel will ask you questions, and the monitoring officer too, followed by the investigating officer and Mrs Hale. Thank you. You have 5 minutes, Councillor Hardcastle. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a question before I do, please.
Sorry?
I have a question for the panel and yourself before I go any further.
This is a case for you, a chance for you to summarise your case, Councillor Hardcastle. Is this relevant to your summary?
That's what I'm asking for guidance on.
Monitoring officer, can you advise me here, please?
Chair, at this stage in the procedure, this is Councillor Hardcastle's opportunity to put forward his views in response to the report received from the investigating officer, so that then thereafter you may have the opportunity to ask questions if you so wish, likewise for Mr Burns and Mrs Hale. So it's now for Councillor Hardcastle to present his case effectively.
Thank you. I'm afraid, Councillor Hardcastle, at this point, it is not the opportunity for you to ask the panel questions. So please present your case in the way that you see best fit. Thank you. You have 5 minutes.
Do I have to do it, or can my representative do it?
It's up to you. That's between your decision.
Okay. And just before he does, do I have an opportunity to speak after this as well on procedures?
It only on the case that's being assessed today, Councillor Hardcastle, within the procedure that we are progressing through at the moment. So we are now on your opportunity to summarise your case, and you have 5 minutes to do that. And please go ahead in the way that you see best fit.
And I will have an opportunity later on to talk about procedure.
No, not today. Thank you, Councillor Hardcastle. That's not within the procedure of the meeting today.
Do you want to do it?
Yeah, we'll do it. Okay, so I'm decided I'm going to.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Brack.
Okay. In Miss Hale's complaint, she accuses Councillor Hardcastle of blocking her application, while Mr. Burns' report, he appears to be investigating whether he delayed her application, which is not the same thing.
Sorry, one moment, Mr. Brack. Sorry to interrupt. Please, could you speak a little bit more slowly and speak up so that everybody in the room can hear? And if you can speak directly into the microphone as well.
Shall I start again then?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
In her complaint, Miss Hale accuses Councillor Hardcastle of blocking her application, while in Mr. Burns' report, he appears to be investigating whether he delayed her application. Not quite the same thing. Mr. Hardcastle's 2020 chairman statement is mentioned. Mr. Burns makes it clear that Miss Hale's complaint is not about the statement content. So the matter to be decided then is whether or not Mr. Hardcastle delayed or blocked Miss Hale's co-option application. Evidence of what happened at each of these council meetings was submitted to Mr. Burns via email. The first meeting, it wasn't on the agenda, the March meeting. The next meeting in July, it again wasn't on the agenda. The agenda was made up for that meeting by the clerk at the time. The meeting, the 1st of September 2020, the vacancy was on the agenda for part 2 of the meeting, but part 1 of the meeting overran, was very busy, went on for 2 hours, and by the time we came around to discussing the application, the clerk announced that the guillotine had dropped. 2 hours was up, and we couldn't progress any further. So again, Councillor Hardcastle no way affected that. The next meeting on Zoom on the 16th of November, the vacancy again was on the agenda. This time, a number of complaints had been made by councillors about the conduct of the clerk, and there was items on the agenda which were directly appertaining to some of those complaints. So it was my feeling that the meeting couldn't go ahead, and I asked for the meeting to be adjourned, to be stopped. Again, nothing to do with Councillor Hardcastle, right? There was a vote in which Councillor Hardcastle didn't vote, and it was carried by a vote of councillors that we would suspend the meeting. The next meeting was the 11th of January, at which Councillor Hale's application, Miss Hale's application was rejected. I felt that this, as the only councillor who'd been there all through this period for 7 years, I introduced the emails that we discussed earlier on, and asked whether the council thought it was right and proper for Miss Hill to be voted on something. And we held a vote and decided she wasn't a fit and proper person, and that we therefore had another vote and rejected her application. So Councillor Hardcastle had nothing to do. He didn't vote again in that. So she had absolutely nothing to do with delaying or blocking her application. And the meetings were the only place where that could have happened. So our contention is that he certainly didn't block or delay her application, and that no evidence has been shown in the. It's simply Mr. Burns' feelings. He says he felt that it was too long, but it was an unfortunate set of circumstances that these things all happened. It couldn't be discussed, and when it was discussed, her application was rejected, as I say. Really, that's really the only
So you have a minute remaining, Mr.
Right.
Brack, if you'd like to make any further
We
statements.
feel that the whole process has been unfair. That Mr. Burns,
Mr. Brack, can I remind you that we are, this is your opportunity to make representations about the items that are under dispute that we outlined earlier, not about the process.
yeah.
Thank you.
Also, just like to point out that in Mr. Hardcastle's statement, he doesn't name anybody. It's kept. Whilst he refers to previous councillors, he hasn't named Miss Earl. You know, he hasn't named her in that statement. It's just referring to to previous councillors, not to
You
anybody.
have 20 seconds, Mr. Brack, to round up your summary.
No, I think that's it really.
Okay.
It's simply that there's no evidence that's been presented of what's been accused.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Panel questions. Councillor Fisher, please go ahead. You need to.
Thank you, Chair. Does Deaton Parish Council have a formal co-option policy in its standing orders or not, please? Sorry, does Deaton Parish Council have a formal co-option policy in its policies? Right. Did you seek any advice from the clerk at the time about the process of co-option, or did you?
It would have been discussed with the clerk, yes.
And what was the clerk's advice, please?
I don't think there was any such advice. It was saying that it had to be discussed. I also took advice of the YLCA as well. You see, it's not, I haven't actually blocked anything, so it's not being blocked.
Councillor Hardcastle, this is the opportunity for you to answer questions from the panel, not to make a statement. You have an opportunity to make representations in the next section. This is opportunity now for people that I outlined earlier to ask questions of you. So that's what we're doing at this point. Thank you. I have a question for you, Councillor Hardcastle. Just to confirm, when was the application from Mrs. Hale received?
I can't remember. Was it March?
March 2020.
Yeah.
Can that be? Yes, that's confirmed. Okay. What happens when applications are received for vacancies on the parish council? What's the procedure that you go through?
I think this is the first one.
Can I just remind you to switch on your microphone if you're going to speak, and speak clearly into the microphone, please? Thank you.
I was just checking the fact. I don't think we have. I think this is the first one we've had while I've been involved with the council.
So are you telling us then that there's no procedure for processing an application to join the parish council? Does it appear in your standing orders?
Well, there will be something in standing orders, yes.
Did you follow that procedure that's within the standing orders?
I believe so.
Okay, right. Following on from that then, once an application is received, how does that application get onto the parish council agenda for consideration? Can you tell me what the process is and who makes the decisions?
On what goes on the agenda?
Particularly around applications to join the parish council. How does that work?
The clerk will put it on the agenda. The clerk writes the agenda, not the chair.
Is there any input from the chair to the agenda for the parish council?
Yes, there is. There's input from all councillors, but the actual clerk writes the agenda.
Okay, so what I'd like to understand is whose responsibility is it to get applications that are received to join the parish council onto a parish council agenda?
It is, whose responsibility is it? Well, it's probably the clerk. Because the clerk writes the agenda. The clerk, if you ask the clerk to, I'd like this added onto the agenda, this is my understanding that the clerk can refuse to put something on the agenda. But I'm not saying that happened here, I'm just making a point.
Okay, can I ask for input from monitoring officer or deputy monitoring officer? Can you give us the legal perspective from a parish council operational viewpoint of who has responsibility for the agenda?
Chair, the responsibility for the formulation and approval of the agenda rests with the chair of the meeting. They do that in consultation with the clerk and also in consultation with any relevant officers that may exist to support the council. But the actual responsibility for the formulation and the cause to publish and the content of the agenda rests with the chair.
Thank you. Sorry, Councillor Chambers, please go ahead.
Councillor Harcus, could you just outline briefly what the process is about deciding what goes on the agenda and who is involved in that process?
Well, it's different to what it was then. Then the clerk produced the agenda, went out to everybody, said, is there anything that you want to add on? Or
everybody sees the draft agenda. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And then who gives the go-ahead to the parish council clerk to actually send the agenda out and make it public?
Well, unless there's any, if there's nothing coming back saying, can you add this or not add this, the clerk then sends it out.
Yeah, but that's not what I asked you. I said, whose responsibility is it to give the go-ahead to the clerk to send that agenda out?
I presume it's me,
Yeah.
Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you.
But actually, no. But that's not correct. I don't think that's correct.
As we understand it within law, that is correct. Monitoring officer, can you confirm that, please? Excuse me, there's no interaction with anybody from...
It is correct in law that the authority comes from the chair.
Thank you.
That's not wrong. Can I answer the question, Chair?
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
That's not what I was told by the clerk at the time.
Okay, so anybody else have any questions at this point? Councillor Fisher.
Thank you. With regard to the statement you made at the annual parish meeting or whenever it was about, which is contained in the complaint, did you have a parish clerk in place at the time of that statement being delivered?
Did we have an interim? Was it just an interim?
Can I just remind everybody this is questions to Councillor Hardcastle, so nobody else is to have input at this point, please.
I think it was Susan. Wasn't. We didn't have one. I can't remember. I thought it was Susan. We've got a difference of opinion. I believe it was Mrs. Mercer that was the clerk. I think.
And did you seek any guidance from an appropriate officer of the YRCA before submitting that statement?
No.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I have a couple of other questions just to, I hope, create some more clarity. What happens if an application to join the parish council comes in between one parish council meeting and another? So it lands in the inbox. What happens to it?
Well, it depends who it goes to. If it goes to the clerk, then the clerk lets everybody know it's come in. If it would come to me, I'd let everybody know it would come in for discussion.
So you acknowledge it to all members of the parish council that there's been an application. Can you then run through what happens next following that?
Then it will be discussed to go on the agenda for a meeting.
Okay. And so at that point in time when Mrs. Hale's application came in March 2020, was there a discussion about putting it on the agenda for the next meeting?
Sorry, I'm just trying. When did we discuss it? I think it missed the March meeting. We're seeking advice from the house. Yeah. Something like that, wasn't it? Sorry, Chair, I'm just trying to remember because it's so far back. It was sent to everybody. I believe we got in touch with the YLCA to seek advice on that. And I think it was too late for the March meeting. And I think we were waiting on advice back from the YLCA, I believe, but I can't be 100% sure.
Okay, and can you just clarify for me then, please? When was the next opportunity that it should have gone or could have gone on to the agenda? And I have to say that I do notice that on your agendas, it says that nothing that doesn't, if something doesn't appear on the agenda, then it can't be discussed. I'm just trying to understand when the next opportunity should have been. If the process had been followed as you outlined, it could have appeared or should have appeared on the agenda for discussion.
July was our next meeting after March.
And did it take, it didn't go on to that agenda, did it?
I can't remember. No, honestly, I can't remember.
No, it didn't. Okay. Why didn't it go on to that agenda?
Like I've stated, I believe we were waiting on advice from the YLCA.
You were waiting on advice from the YLCA?
I believe so, yeah.
About what?
About what to do with the co-option.
So why would this have been, why was it necessary to get advice from the YLCA? Because it seems like it's a regular procedure within a parish council to accept an application and consider it at a meeting.
Because of my chairman's statement previously.
Sorry?
Because I think it's because of my chairman's statement previously. Was that before then? Was it not? Was it not?
Okay. Right. One final question then. Why did Mrs. Hale's application take so long to make it onto an agenda when you've already told me that it was discussed as the application came in March 2020 and there were a number of opportunities for it to be on there?
Yeah. Yeah, so it was too late for the March agenda. And our next meeting was July?
Yeah.
It was July.
And it didn't appear on there.
No.
And I did ask earlier why that was. I don't think we've had that answer yet.
Sorry.
Why didn't it appear on the July meeting agenda?
I think the clerk produced the agenda, and I was informed by the clerk at that time that the clerk decides what goes on the agenda.
Okay, all right. Anybody have any other questions from the panel?
No questions, deliberations.
No, okay, thank you. That's the end of the questions from the panel. Monitoring officer, do you have some questions?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I do. In questioning from Councillor Fisher asked around the procedures and the timing about receipt of advice in respect of the responding and action to be taken for Mrs. Hale's application. In response, Councillor Hardcastle indicated that he thought they received advice from YA, Yorkshire Association of Local Councils. I'd just like to clarify the timeline of when that advice was sought. So Mrs. Hale's application was made around the time for March, and also the application didn't meet the July which you've established, Chair. So I'd just like to understand the timing of when the advice was sought from the Yorkshire Association of Local Councils and whether there was any chase-up undertaken of that association to receive advice promptly.
Okay, Councillor Hardcastle, can you answer that question, please? When did you ask for advice from YLC, and was there any follow-up, any chasing for that advice?
I honestly can't remember. I'm not going to sit here and tell you the truth. I can't remember.
Okay, thank you. Monitoring officer? No further questions from the monitoring officer, thank you. Mr. Burns, as the investigating officer, do you have any questions for Councillor Hardcastle?
Can you tell me when you, the then clerk, sent you an email giving you advice about how to deal with a co-option? Can you tell me when the information was passed to you by the clerk about what the Yorkshire Council Association had, the advice that had been given to you about how to deal with co-options? I think you said before, Councillor, but you couldn't remember when you'd received any information or whether it had been sought.
I can't remember the dates.
You've sent me evidence, you sent me an email with that advice given to you from the clerk at the time. I'm just wondering if you can name the date of it.
Well, if you've got the email there, you can tell me the date.
15th of October.
It was when, sorry?
15th of October.
Well, there you go then. So why ask me the question if you've got the
answer? You said you couldn't.
Can I just remind you that this is an opportunity to go across the table, that questions should come through and answers should come through me. Okay, so I think that Mr. Burns said that the advice was received from YLCA, sorry, apologies. YLCA on the 15th of October.
With advice that it should be dealt with immediately.
With advice that it should be dealt with immediately.
And that was part of the evidence that the subject counsellor himself sent to me as part of his case.
Okay, thank you.
In October.
15th of
October, yeah.
Investigating officer, Mr. Burns, do you have any further questions for Councillor Hardcastle?
Just raise this because Councillor Brack mentioned it about the blocking, not blocking situation. The meeting in January 21, you chaired that meeting. Is that correct?
Sorry, sir. Again, sorry.
Did you chair the meeting? Were you at the meeting?
Of which meeting?
The January 21 meeting when the application was actually decided.
Yes.
Yes. Did you declare an interest at that meeting?
As in an interest of what?
Any interest in any other matters that would be considered at that meeting?
In regard to what?
Anything. With regards to anything, did you declare an interest at that meeting? In specifically about the application of the complaint?
No.
When you knew a complaint had been made against you? Okay. Did you withdraw from that meeting, or did you stay there and chair the meeting?
I didn't withdraw from the meeting because of the items on the agenda, and I didn't vote. But
did you stay at the meeting while the application was being considered?
Sorry?
Did you stay at the meeting and chair the meeting while the application of the complainant's application was considered?
Yes.
Right. Thank you.
Okay,
No further questions.
thank you.
The complaint wasn't on the agenda.
Mrs Hale, do you have any questions for Councillor Hardcastle?
Yes, I do. We've already discussed this letter.
Can you speak a bit
Sorry,
closer
through
to-
me, please.
We've
Mrs.
already
Hale.
discussed the letter that was circulated to councillors. Can I ask where that came from? Obviously, Mr. Hardcastle must have scrolled through the laptop to find the evidence, because Mr. Brack has no access to the laptop.
Sorry, Mrs Hale, forgive me, I'm struggling to understand the relevance of the question or the letter that you're referring to. Sorry, you might need to be a bit clearer to me.
The letter that was circulated and voted on to refuse my co-option, that was circulated by Councillor Brack.
Okay, so we're talking about the advice given from the YLCA.
No.
Well, no, but I also have a copy of that email, and it was CYC, YLCA and the National Association of Local Councils that all gave the same directives.
Okay.
And I also have a copy here of...
Mrs Hale, is this a question for Mr Hardcastle?
Yes, I have a
Sorry,
copy of
Councillor Hardcastle.
Deaton Parish Council standing orders and voting appointments, paragraph A, advises on electing or co-opting a parish councillor. Has Mr Hardcastle read it?
Have you read the standing orders, Miss Councillor Hardcastle, particularly the area around co-option and voting on members of the parish council?
I have it some time ago, yes.
Thank you.
The Chair, there was another question before then that I can answer if you want me to answer. Mrs Hale put another.
Yes,
I think
okay.
she-
Mrs Hale, could you repeat your first question and be very clear to me what communication we're talking about, because there has been a lot of pieces of paper, so that everybody's very clear what you're referring to.
Yeah, it was circulated before the 11th of January. It's a copy of an email sent between myself and the previous clerk with reference to asking my husband to bring a gun. And as I've explained, that was banter to alleviate her being so upset. And I want to know where the copy came from that was circulated to to the council prior to discussing my co-option.
I can answer.
I'm not sure that I think that's relevant in helping the panel to understand the issues that we're talking about today. I'm not sure that I feel that that's a question that's necessary to answer, to be honest. I don't think that it adds to our information.
I'm willing to answer it if you want.
No, there's no need.
Right.
We're focusing on the issues at hand that were outlined at the beginning of the meeting. So any questions around that?
Yes.
That's
Councillor
absolutely fine.
Hardcastle stated that he was waiting for a response from YLCA. Why was that? Is that because of a discussion that had taken place regarding barring my application? Why else would he need to seek advice?
Councillor Hardcastle, can you be clear to everybody why you felt you needed to seek advice from the YLCA?
Sorry, give me 2 seconds. My representative, he feels it was the clerk that asked for the advice. I'm not sure if it was the clerk or me, to be honest with you.
No, what we asked is why, not who.
Right, okay. Because of the past conduct of Mrs. Hale as a councillor. I think, no.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Hale, do you have any other questions?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Right. We have 2 options now. We could carry on into representations, or we could take 30 minutes for a lunch break at this point and come back at 20 to 1. I feel like this is likely a natural break in proceedings. Is everybody in agreement with that? Happy to take a break now and then come back at 12:40, 20 to 1. Yes? Yeah. Okay, thank you. We will reconvene at 20 to 1 in 30 minutes. Thank you, everybody. We're reconvening this hearing panel today. Time is 12:45. And as I mentioned before the break, we are moving into the next stage of the hearing. And just for everybody's information as well, Mrs. Hale's representative, Mrs. Mercer, has had to leave, so she will no longer be in the meeting. So we move into representations, and I will now invite the parties to make any representations on the facts in dispute. The parties will each have 10 minutes to make their representations. We will hear from the parties in the following order: Investigating Officer, Mrs. Hale, and then Councillor Hardcastle. So to start this session then, Mr. Burns, please can you give us your representations? You have 10 minutes, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I started off at the beginning basically saying I was looking at the feeling, the animosity or bad feeling between the parties, and then the delay, and then whether the two were linked and leading, if that then led to a breach of the code. Everything I've heard today.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt again, Mr. Burns. Please, could you just speak up a bit and speak into the microphone? So I know people even across the table can't hear very well. Thank you.
Okay. At the beginning of the meeting, I reiterated the 3 points with the animosity between the parties, the delay in dealing with the matter, and whether those two were linked and therefore led to a breach of the code. My summing up would be that an animosity and bad feeling is obvious and has obviously come out throughout the meeting. Regarding the delay, I'll reiterate my comments that, and I think has also been brought out during the meeting itself, it is the chairman who drives the agenda for the business of a council, whether that's a parish council, city council, county council. The clerk is there to help and advise. And therefore, the delay of 10 months in dealing with the matter, in my view, was failing in the responsibility of the chairman to see that business get onto the agenda and being dealt with in a timely manner. The reasons for that, I think, are quite clear, based on the statements that were made in his annual statement. The decision to seek advice on the co-option issue, I don't see as required. There is a policy on co-option in the parish council's policy, which the subject councillor doesn't seem to be too close to. And even when advice was received, and advice given by the then clerk to deal with the matter expeditiously, and that there was no real reason why not to, it was still not dealt with for many months after that. On the blocking issue, again, the subject councillor constantly reiterated that there was no evidence about blocking. I think that's been clear during the meeting. In the summing up, they raised the issue of no blocking. I'd just like to reiterate the point of the actual meeting itself in January 21, when the chairman of the council actually chaired that meeting without declaring an interest regarding the application for co-option, even though he knew a complaint had been made against him at that time about the co-option not happening. He chaired the meeting, he didn't declare an interest, he didn't withdraw from the meeting. He was influencing that meeting, therefore, by his presence. And no doubt the answer may well have been the same, but his presence there, as is fully accepted by General Code of Conduct, is influenced the meeting, and in itself could well be a breach of the Code of Conduct. And at that stage, Chair, I'm happy to leave it there.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Councillor Hardcastle, can I ask you what you're doing, please?
I'm leaving because I can't stand anymore and listen to a man who's supposed to be an investigator to say that I influenced a meeting when I certainly did not influence the meeting.
Councillor Hardcastle,
you've asked me to talk, so I'm talking. If you want me to go, I'll go.
No, I don't want you to go. I want you to participate in this because we have got to this point and it is only fair for everybody that's here and the public that we hear it through to its end.
I've got so many procedural errors here, and you're not letting me. You've already told me I'm not going to be able to speak about procedural errors. That man said,
Councillor Hardcastle,
this complaint for Mrs. Hale went to me and Deaton Parish Council. That man said you can't have a complaint against the Parish Council.
Okay, so are you withdrawing then, Councillor Hardcastle?
I'm not prepared to stay here. It's unfair.
I'd just like to make it public that Councillor Hardcastle has decided to withdraw from the procedure, and
totally unfair.
There is no apparent reason within the procedure as to why he should do that. No, excuse me, Mr. Brack, it's not your opportunity to speak at this point. Can I ask for legal advice, please? Can we adjourn? Thank you.
Absolutely, Chair. The room is cleared so that yourselves remain in the room to the exclusion of all others, save for Mrs. Young and Mr. Jackson and ourselves.
Yes, please. Could the members of the public and the interested parties please leave the room, and the investigating officer? Thank you. Thank you, everybody. We're reconvening this hearing panel subcommittee of the Joint Standards Committee. As the public will be aware, that Councillor Hardcastle, who is the subject councillor, decided that he would not take part in the meeting from this point forward. We have made efforts to allow him to come back into the meeting through his own decision-making process, and also given him the opportunity to authorise Mr. Brack, his representative, to speak on his behalf through the rest of the meeting. But both Councillor Hardcastle and Mr. Brack have declined those offers and won't be participating in the meeting from this point forward. So we have heard from him through the summaries. He was able to question the cases put forward by the investigating officer and also Mrs. Hale. but he won't be making his representations, which is the opportunity for him to inform the panel the sections of what we've heard today that he doesn't agree with, and he won't hear in person the outcome of the case, but he will be informed. And because he has participated to this point, and we have given him the opportunity to come back in and participate now, even after he told us he was leaving, that we will carry on with the hearing as outlined in the procedure. So we heard from the investigating officer, Mr. Burns. The next person to give their representations in 10 minutes is Mrs. Hale. So Mrs. Hale, would you like to give your representation? And as another reminder, please speak up and into the microphone. Thank you.
I'll try and lean forward. I found this whole experience quite daunting from the point of view of not sure what procedures, although you did inform us, I think it would be helpful if there was something written down. I didn't realise I was to make a submission.
Mrs. Hale, sorry to interrupt. Given that we are following the procedure as outlined, this is an opportunity for you to make representations about the information that you've heard today, rather than to talk about procedure, which is exactly the same advice that I gave to Councillor Hardcastle. Thank you.
Well, I don't really know what else to say, except that I went through my notes that I made earlier on, and on a final note, I have with my husband run a very successful arboricultural business 30 years, and I know the importance of legislation, regulations and protocols as defined by law that have to be adhered to. And I feel that the parish council, since the first clerk left, has slipped into some semblance of disrepair, and they're not following procedures, they're not following standing orders. I have a copy of the standing orders, and it clearly states in there about co-option as well as all of the legislative things. And I do know that Mr. Hardcastle was advised by the new clerk on several points of legalities that he chose to ignore. But that's about all I can say.
Thank you, Mrs. Hale. At this point, we would be asking Councillor Hardcastle or his representative to make their representations, and they would be given 10 minutes, but unfortunately, we won't be hearing from him. And so at this point, we move into deliberations. And the subcommittee will now withdraw to consider the decision to be made on this case. We will also have, we won't have a break before we reconvene, because I think we've had enough breaks so far. The Democratic Services Officer will contact all of the parties when the panel are in a position to announce their findings. The monitoring officer, deputy monitoring officer, independent person who will join us remotely, and Democratic Services Officer will stay with the subcommittee. So therefore, I'm sorry to the public, this was a short-lived return to the room, but if you could leave us, please, and also investigating officer and Mrs. Hale, we will make our deliberations, and you are more than welcome to stay. I can't really tell you how long it will take. That's very difficult for me. But you are more than welcome to stay and come back in to hear the outcome. So thank you for that. Thank you, everybody, for rejoining us. Some of the people who were present in the meeting have now left us. Mrs. Hale has left us, and we are, the investigating officer is the only remaining person outside of officers and the panel. So we reconvene the standards hearing, and I will start with the announcement of our findings and the evidence and findings of fact. Mrs. Hale's complaint relates to an allegation that Councillor Hardcastle has a personal animosity towards Mrs. Hale, and that he had delayed her application to be co-opted back onto the council because of this. Mrs. Hale referred to the chair's statement of the annual meeting of the parish council in 2020 as evidence of this. As detailed within the investigator's report, Councillor Hardcastle stated that he stood by the chair's statement, which he confirmed was correct. The panel explored the action taken to process Mrs. Hale's application for co-option to Deaton Parish Council. The panel noted that her application had been submitted in March 2020. However, it was not determined by the parish council until January 2021. The panel questioned Councillor Hardcastle as to the reasoning for this lengthy resolution and queried the steps he took to receive advice from his clerk and or the Yorkshire Local Councils Association. The panel considered carefully the explanations put forward, in particular in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. The panel noted that there were 3 meetings where this could have been considered. The panel was not persuaded by the reasoning provided by Councillor Hardcastle, which could satisfactorily address the delay. The panel also queried whether Councillor Hardcastle was aware of Deaton Parish Council's standing orders in respect of co-option of parish councillors. The panel was not satisfied by the vagueness of Councillor Hardcastle's responses to questions and remained concerned as to his potential lack of knowledge of the council's governance arrangements. The panel formed the view that as chair of the council, Councillor Hardcastle ought to have made himself aware of the relevant standing orders. All of the parties were given the opportunity to make representations during the hearing. It is noted that Councillor Hardcastle left the hearing before his opportunity arose. Councillor Hardcastle was given opportunity to return to the hearing or for his representative to make representations on his behalf. However, Councillor Hardcastle declined the opportunity and withdrew from the hearing. The panel heard representations from the investigating officer and Mrs. Hale. Mr. Burns set out that the main point for his consideration was to look at the feelings between the parties and the delay in the application to co-opt, and whether this led to a breach of the code of conduct. Mrs. Hale stated that she believed that the parish council's standing orders clearly stated the procedures around co-option and that she felt that there were certain things which the councillor chose to ignore. Our conclusions. In respect of the areas of dispute, the panel make the following findings. Mrs. Hale believed Parish Councillor Hardcastle had a personal animosity towards her. The panel considered the chair's 2020 statement, which has been referred to as part of this complaint. The panel determined that this statement clearly referred to Mrs. Hale and Councillor Hardcastle's comment that he will resist any attempt for these individuals to rejoin the council was directed towards Mrs. Hale, amongst others. In the panel's view, this supports the proposition that there was animosity towards Mrs. Hale. Number 2, that there was a delay in Mrs. Hale's application to be co-opted. The panel are satisfied that there was clearly a delay in dealing with Mrs. Hale's application. The panel accepted that the delay was 10 months when there were opportunities to have dealt with the application. It was Councillor Hardcastle's responsibility as chair of the parish council to ensure that such applications should be dealt with in a timely manner and that his animosity towards Mrs. Hale may have negatively impacted on the timescale. The panel determined that the explanations given for the delay, including the COVID pandemic and seeking external advice, were insufficient to account for the length of the delay. Number 3, Chair's 2020 annual statement. The panel find that it is reasonable that the comments made by Councillor Hardcastle in his capacity as Chair of the Parish Council breached the Nolan Principles and did not demonstrate respect to others. Number 4, the panel noted the comments made by Councillor Hardcastle in relation to the procedure. However, the panel remains satisfied that the procedures surrounding the management of this hearing have been adhered to, noting that the procedures are published on the Council's website. It is unfortunate that despite being given the opportunity, Councillor Hardcastle did not remain to present his final submissions to outline further details of his concern to the panel. Taking into account the points above, the panel has decided to uphold the investigating officer's findings that Councillor Hardcastle has breached Deaton Parish Council's Code of Conduct. Had we had other members of the people participating in the hearing today left with us, we would have considered their input into sanctions, but because there is nobody here to give us any input, we will conclude that section and move to announcement of decision as made by the panel. The panel makes the following sanctions: formally report the findings of the panel to the Parish Council. 2, recommend that the Parish Council arrange mandatory training for Parish Councillor Hardcastle around chairing skills, including the Code of Conduct and Parish Council governance. Other observations: there appeared to be a lack of knowledge of procedures and roles. In light of this, the panel wished to bring to Deaton Parish Council's attention the following observations. The Parish Council would benefit from training on the Code of Conduct, training for the whole Parish Council around agenda setting and Parish Council procedures, and take the opportunity of the support and services of the Yorkshire Local Councils Association and maximise the support available. It is recommended that such opportunities are also offered to the Parish Council Clerk. The panel will provide the Yorkshire Local Councils Association with a copy of this decision. That now brings this hearing to a close. Thank you for all attending, and the full decision document will be published on the Council's website. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.